Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're about to plunge into a region that echoes with history, a crossroads that hasn't just witnessed the rise and fall of empires, but, actively shaped them, connecting distant lands for millennia.
Absolutely. Imagine this. You dig in Turkmenistan today and find artifacts left by people from the Harappan civilization thousands of years ago. It's incredible.
Right. Or you look back at migrations and see these nomadic groups coming from Central Asia, bringing domesticated horses, which was like a transformative technology, wasn't it, to the Indian subcontinent.
Totally game-changing. And then, of course, there's the legendary Silk Road, that intricate web. It wasn't just about moving goods.
No, it wove together cultures, ideas, even diseases across these huge, almost unimaginable distances. Central Asia and India, their past isn't just connected, it feels profoundly intertwined.
It's a connection that really underlies so much of the history of the Eurasian landmass.
Yeah.
These weren't just peripheral interactions. They were central to the flow of human civilization across continents.
A constant exchange back and forth, like you said, a fascinating historical dance.
A dance.
And while those ancient echoes are powerful, the dance definitely continues, but maybe the music has changed a bit.
That's a good way to put it.
So today, our deep dive is into the modern chapter of this relationship. We're focusing specifically on India's policy towards Central Asia right now, and the core forces, the key drivers shaping that policy.
And our guide for this deep dive is, well, a stack of source material that meticulously maps out this really complex relationship. It takes us from those ancient roots right through the clash of empires.
All the way up to today's strategic imperatives and the intricate interplay of global powers that are vying for influence in the region?
It's still very much a strategic chessboard.
Definitely. So our mission for you in this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to unpack the key historical moments that created the bedrock of this relationship, understand how India's interests and policies in Central Asia have evolved over time.
Identify the strategic games being played by global players, because let's be honest, it's still very much a great game out there, just maybe with new players or rules.
Exactly. And finally, shine a light on the unique challenges India faces as it tries to fully reconnect with this absolutely crucial part of its extended neighborhood.
Right. Our goal is basically to give you that shortcut, that clear understanding of a vital, dynamic, and frankly, often overlooked part of the world.
Okay, so let's start by really getting a feel for Central Asia itself, its geography, its history. It makes it unique. Our source material calls it a prized territory throughout history.
And you only have to look at a map to see why, right? It's smack in the middle of Eurasia. It's this land bridge connecting East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Europe.
A natural hub. So it's been a target for empire builders forever. We're talking huge names. Genghis Khan, his empire had Central Asia at its core.
Timur Beg, centuries later, reviving its glory. Even Alexander of Macedonia pushed his conquests into parts of the region. Its location just made it this center of movement, both, peaceful trade and, well, armies marching through.
And the most enduring symbol of this centrality has got to be the Silk Route, right? That ancient network.
Absolutely. By the early Christian era, maybe the 1st century CE, it wasn't just one road. It was this complex network of land routes, the main artery connecting the Far East, mostly China, with markets in the Mediterranean and Europe.
And initially, the source highlights Chinese influence was huge. The Han Dynasty pushed west, secured the routes, controlled the silk trade. That's where the name comes from.
But power dynamics on the Silk Road, like everything, were fluid. Around the 6th, 7th centuries, we see this major shift. Islam starts its rapid expansion from the Arab world, making big inroads into Central Asia.
And this wasn't just religious change, it was cultural, economic.
Right. Arab traders, administrators, they took over much of the control, facilitating trade, integrating the region into the expanding Islamic world. It's interesting, though, even as Chinese political influence waned for a bit, things like silkworm cultivation, which came from China originally, they stuck around in places like the Fergana Valley. Shows how deep those economic roots were.
Wow. And this period also saw powerful local empires rise up, didn't it? Persian and Turkic ones?
Yes, exactly. Empires like the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, later the Seljuks, they controlled key hubs on the route, got wealthy from the trade, and fostered these incredible centers of culture, learning, art.
And their impact is still visible today.
Oh, profoundly. In the architecture, the languages, the whole cultural landscape of Central Asia, it's a lasting legacy from that era of, well, relative prosperity and power.
Okay, so that covers the ancient and early medieval times. Let's jump forward quite a bit now to the 18th and 19th centuries. A very different kind of competition emerges. This is when the Russian Tsar begins the systematic annexation of Central Asia.
And the source material points to a key driver for this Russian expansion. The aggressive consolidation of the British Empire down in India.
Right. The British were steadily expanding control, moving north, moving west, and the Russians saw this getting closer and closer.
They perceived it as a direct and growing security threat to Russia's southern borders, its strategic interests in the Caucasus.
So the Tsar's immediate goal wasn't necessarily invading India itself, right? It was more defensive.
More about creating a buffer zone, yeah. And crucially, preventing the British from controlling territories directly to their south, especially Afghanistan. Securing Afghanistan, or at least keeping it out of British hands, was seen as vital for Russian security.
Okay, so to counter this perceived British threat, Russia starts consolidating its power across Central Asia.
They captured the strategic city of Tashkent in 1865, and by 1881 they had a strong military and administrative presence in the Transcaspian region. This pushed the Russian frontier southwards.
And this intense competition between the Russian Empire and the British Empire basically turns Central Asia into this strategic buffer zone.
Exactly. Used by Russia specifically to check British expansion moving north from India.
And the British felt exactly the same way, just in reverse. They saw Russian expansion towards Afghanistan, towards Persia, as this direct, almost existential threat to their jewel in the crown in India.
That fear drove British policy. It led them to fight multiple Anglo-Afghan wars throughout the 19th century, desperately trying to either control Afghanistan directly or at least establish dominant influence there.
So in this high-stakes game, Afghanistan and Central Asia become these maybe unwilling buffer states caught between two giants?
Very much caught in the middle. And the British, in a really notable move, strategically established the Wakhan Corridor in Afghanistan during boundary talks in the late 19th century.
That narrow stream of land.
Yeah. Specifically designed to create a physical barrier, a buffer, preventing a direct border between Russian and British territories, to keep Russian influence contained.
And this whole scenario, this intense 19th century rivalry between Britain and Russia for influence, control, information across Central Asia, Persia, Afghanistan, that's what became known as the Great Game.
Famously, yes.
Yeah.
Both sides were deeply invested. The British set up extensive intelligence networks, embedding agents, gathering info on Russian moves, trying to guess the next play. It was a game of shadows just as much as armies.
Cloak and dagger stuff.
Definitely. And the strategic importance of this whole Eurasian heartland was maybe best articulated by the geographer Halford Mackinder back in 1904.
His heartland theory.
Right. His idea was basically that whoever controlled this central region, the heartland, particularly if it was Russia, would gain such a strategic advantage they could project power globally, maybe even become a dominant world power. That idea certainly fueled the rivalry.
Okay, so that's the Tsarist colonial rule and the classic Great Game. What happened under Soviet power? Our source looks at the theory and practice of Soviet rule there.
Well, from about 1865, when the Tsar started annexation, until 1918, Central Asia was basically a Russian colony. But then, in the interwar period, with the Bolsheviks consolidating power, the region came under direct Soviet rule, organized into these ethnic-based republics.
How did that compare to European colonialism elsewhere?
That's debated. Scholars, like Francine Hirsch and Empire of Nations, argue that while Soviet rule was definitely authoritarian and certainly extractive in many ways, it wasn't simply exploitative in quite the same way as, say, British rule in India.
Interesting distinction. What's the argument?
The argument is that while there was exploitation, especially economic, the Soviets also made significant investments. They poured resources into education, literacy campaigns, infrastructure like electrification.
So not just resource extraction.
No, there was a strong element of state building mixed in with the imperial control. Hirsch also argues the Soviets consciously avoided a simple divide and rule based purely on ethnicity. Instead, they tried to create nations within the Soviet framework, though obviously controlled by Moscow.
But economically, they still followed colonial patterns, right? Focusing on raw materials.
Oh, absolutely. They brought in large-scale industrialization, but it was often geared towards processing resources like cotton and energy, which were then shipped off to the industrial heartlands in Russia and other Soviet republics. So the economic relationship was still heavily tilted towards Moscow's needs.
Seems like a unique mix.
Yeah, Oksana Dmitrieva calls the Soviet experience there a unique case with no parallel. Modernization, repression, economic control, all mixed together.
And our source mentions Alexander Cooley's idea of patrimonial states to explain how Soviet authority was maintained. Can you unpack that?
Yes, Cooley's argument is insightful. He suggests Moscow didn't rely solely on formal state institutions in the Central Asian republics. Instead, they often maintained control by channeling resources and political power through existing regional and sub-regional informal institutions.
Like powerful clans and local elites.
Exactly. They essentially worked through these existing networks, distributing patronage and resources to keep these local power structures loyal and compliant, rather than building up strong, independent, formal state structures in the republics themselves.
So control through informal, almost personalistic networks, not just bureaucracy.
Precisely. And the source notes this system, despite its complexities, actually worked remarkably well in maintaining stability. There were hardly any mass uprisings or major challenges to Soviet power in Central Asia, even during Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika in the late 80s.
A time when other parts of the Soviet Union were seeing huge dissent.
Right. That control system, leveraging those patrimonial networks, proved quite durable.
Which brings us to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and what many people are calling the new great game in Central Asia. Suddenly, these 5 republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, are independent.
Independent, yes, but largely under the leadership of former Soviet-era elites who very quickly consolidated power as authoritarian rulers.
And they clamped down pretty fast, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They established firm control over key levers, state media, domestic security forces. Their main goal was regime survival, ensuring one party, often highly centralized rule, continued, often resembling those old patrimonial structures just under new national flags.
And opposition?
Often suppressed or forced into exile. Any perceived threats to the rulers, whether it was genuine political dissent or potential extremist activity, were often, as the source puts it, well conflated, meaning threats to the regime were deliberately framed as existential security threats to justify crackdowns.
Interestingly, though, the source says this initial period after independence saw an immediate absence of deep interest from the major global powers compared to the 19th century Great Game.
It did, paradoxically, and that created new spaces for other actors to rush in. With Moscow's influence diminished, you saw Western-led civil society groups moving in, promoting pluralism, democracy, market economies.
And at the same time,
simultaneously, conservative religious movements, particularly from Saudi Arabia, started actively spreading Wahhabism and other forms of Salafist Islam. Central Asia became this significant new space for propagating different, sometimes radical religious agendas.
Meanwhile, the old players were busy elsewhere.
Russia was deep in its own post-Soviet chaos domestically. China, though, was more focused and strategic. Their first big move was the Shanghai Five initiative in '96, specifically to sort out those long-standing border disputes inherited from the Soviet era.
And the U.S., they were promoting NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, but held back in Central Asia initially.
Right, they refrained from deep security or military engagement there at first. But despite Washington's initial relative distance, Russia, just because of its deep historical roots, infrastructure, cultural ties, remained the major external player by default, even if weakened.
But then came 9/11. And everything changed. Suddenly, Central Asia's geography was critical again.
Absolutely critical. It transformed the region into this crucial hub for the USA's global war on terrorism, especially for operations in neighboring Afghanistan.
So the U.S. needed access, basing rights.
They moved quickly, concluded flying and refueling agreements, set up air bases and logistical centers in places like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. But this big U.S. presence also gave the Central Asian states new leverage.
How so?
The source points out they used this moment to assert their own local rules. They cooperated on counterterrorism, sure, but they were very firm and successful in limiting U.S. influence when it came to pushing for domestic political reforms, democratization, human rights stuff.
So they basically used the U.S. need for access to reinforce their own internal power structures.
That's a key insight, yes. Regime stability trumped American calls for political opening. And this period, post 9/11, truly marked the revival of a competitive great game, but with new players. The U.S., China, and Russia.
Central Asia again became an arena of high geopolitics.
Where these powers actively tried to buy local loyalties, offering aid, security cooperation, political support, explicitly to block their rivals from gaining too much advantage.
It's fascinating how history repeats, or at least rhymes. Okay, let's shift focus now specifically to India's side of this equation. How far back do India's connections with Central Asia really go?
Incredibly deep. Millennia, not just centuries. Our source material points to archaeological proof, like the site of Altyn Tepe in Turkmenistan, Bronze Age, maybe 3rd millennium BC. They found Harappan artifacts there. Clear proof of interaction way back then.
That's mind-blowing. And beyond just trading stuff, there were big movements of people, too.
Definitely. Around the 2nd millennium BC, significant migrations of Indo-Aryan groups from the Central Asian steppes down towards the Indian subcontinent. They brought crucial innovations, domesticated horses, maybe early Vedic traditions, profoundly impacting the subcontinent's cultures.
And connecting these worlds, again, the Silk Route, but a specific southern branch.
Exactly. A significant southern branch linked Central Asia directly with northern India. Crucial for moving goods, but also peoples, ideas. It brought major nomadic groups into India over centuries. Sakas, Parthians, later the Kushanas.
Right, the Kushanas. They weren't just invaders. They left a lasting cultural mark, especially with Buddhism.
They did. Their empire, 1st to 3rd centuries CE, stretched across northern India and parts of Central Asia. They were major patrons of Buddhism. Under their rule, Buddhism didn't just flourish there, it spread outwards along the Silk Route into other parts of Central Asia, into China.
You can still see traces of that Buddhist influence in the region.
Oh yeah, and archaeological remains, historical texts, especially in places like Afghanistan and the Tarim Basin, a direct legacy of the Silk Route and that Kushana connection.
So the Silk Route was this massive engine of cultural exchange for India, too, bringing in new things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just India exporting spices. India received new influences in art, religion, technology. But the source notes, trade along that classic Silk Route started declining significantly in the medieval period, maybe around the 17th centuries. Geopolitical shifts, like Sasanian Persia's hostility to Byzantium, disrupted flows.
And the spread of Islam across Central Asia and into India must have changed the dynamic as well.
It did. Islam got firmly rooted in Central Asia, then gradually spread into northern India. This did give some new impetus to trade within the growing Islamic world, but maybe never reached the same scale or cultural breadth as the ancient Silk Route era.
What kinds of goods were moving back and forth then?
Indians kept exporting textiles like cotton, shawls, dyes, traditional medicines like Ayurvedic products, and importing essential things like high-quality horses from Central Asia, gold, dried fruits.
And Indians even settled there, small diaspora.
Yes, traders, merchants, setting up communities in key cities along the roads. But towards the later medieval period, another big shift. The rise of European maritime trade with the Far East.
Bypassing the land routes.
Right. As European powers took control of the sea lanes, Muslim and Persian traders controlling the land routes tried to strengthen their grip on what remained to protect their interests.
Our source has a case study on the economic contributions of the Silk Route to India, beyond just the goods traded.
Yeah, this highlights how it transformed parts of India's economic structure, bringing new crafts and technologies. Kashmir is a really visible example. From ancient times, intensifying the medieval period, skilled craftsmen migrated from Central Asia to Kashmir, bringing their expertise.
What specific skills?
Especially textile crafts, intricate embroidery. They practiced these in Kashmir, shared their technology, their know-how with local artisans.
And that led to Kashmir's fame for shawls.
Directly contributed to it. Kashmir gained this prominence for making high-quality shawls, a reputation for craftsmanship that persists today. It's a direct legacy of those Central Asian connections.
Any other examples of tech transfer?
Yes, the historian Irfan Habib notes that irrigation tech also came via the Silk Route. He points to the Noria, this ancient water wheel for lifting water, as something that arrived in India through these land connections. Shows the route's importance for practical innovations, too.
So we see these deep ancient and medieval ties, then trade declines, sea routes rise, and the political map gets redrawn. British India, Russian Central Asia. How did the Great Game itself hit the India-Central Asia relationship?
It fundamentally changed it, turned direct connection into distance and rivalry. As the Mughals weakened, India came under British control. Central Asia, as we discussed, fell under Russian control. The rivalry between these two empires led to the Great Game, which the source kind of breaks into 3 phases regarding the India-CA link.
Phase 1 being the creation of that buffer zone we talked about.
Exactly. The Tsar pushing south, taking Tashkent, alarming the British. They respond with the Anglo-Afghan Wars. This phase, mid-19th to early 20th century, was about establishing these formal buffer areas, Afghanistan and parts of Persia becoming contested zones.
Phase 2, maybe 1907 to 1917, sounds like it was all about spying.
It really was. Borders and buffers mostly set, the intensity shifted to espionage. Border regions, buffer states became fertile ground for British and Russian agents, spying, gathering intel, trying to stay one step ahead. The real cloak and dagger phase.
Then Phase 3, after the 1917 Russian Revolution, saw the Soviets cement control over Central Asia.
Yes. Bolsheviks consolidate power, bring Central Asia firmly under Soviet rule. This gave Moscow direct access to resources, like the vast cotton lands heavily exploited to support Soviet industrialization. And throughout this whole period, Tsarist and Soviet Russia exerted strong cultural influence too.
Leading to Russian becoming the lingua franca across the republic.
Exactly. After WWII, the Soviets formalized the structure further, divided Central Asia into 5 Soviet Socialist republics: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, mostly along ethnic lines, though Moscow often drew those lines for political reasons. Foreign policy, big decisions, all controlled by Moscow.
India, newly independent after 47, pursuing non-alignment during the Cold War, had limited direct access because of the Soviet control. But the source says the USSR allowed some interaction.
They did. Despite Cold War divisions, the Soviets allowed some cultural interaction as part of their broader relationship with India. State-sponsored cultural programs, music, dance festivals, film exchanges.
Bollywood became popular there?
Surprisingly popular, yes.
Yeah.
Indian cinema, music created a sense of familiarity. But India's non-alignment meant it couldn't develop deep, direct political or strategic ties with the republics themselves. Everything was filtered through the Soviet prism.
Okay, so that takes us to the end of the Cold War, 1991, Soviet Union gone, republics independent. What was India's approach to this totally new situation?
India's foreign policy thinkers started developing this idea of a concentric circle approach. First circle, immediate neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. Second circle, the extended neighborhood, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and importantly, Central Asia. Third circle, the great powers.
And Central Asia fit neatly into that second circle. Historical ties, now open for direct engagement.
A major opportunity. India moved fairly quickly, established fresh diplomatic ties, signed new treaties with all 5 republics, no longer viewing them just through the lens of the USSR relationship. They could engage one-on-one.
And India itself was changing rapidly then, too, economically.
Massively. Transitioning from a closed, state-run economy to a more open, liberalized market. This started in the early 90s and quickly generated this growing need for resources to fuel growth.
And Central Asia is swimming in resources, oil, gas, minerals.
Exactly. So the region gained significant new economic importance. But alongside this opportunity, there was a really urgent concern for India: the risk of religious extremism taking root and spreading in these newly independent, mostly Muslim states.
Tied to the situation in Afghanistan, with the jihadi groups left over from the anti-Soviet war.
Yes. When the USSR collapsed, many groups dispersed. High potential for spillover into Central Asia. India specifically feared that if Central Asia became an extremist hotbed, it could give Pakistan strategic depth.
Meaning Pakistan could use the region for bases, support, influence against India, especially in Kashmir.
Precisely. So India realized reviving ties wasn't just about history or culture. It was a crucial security imperative to prevent instability spilling over.
Did India see any advantages it had in approaching these new states?
It did. India saw its identity as a large functioning democracy, its secular outlook, its multicultural society, as potential role models for Central Asian states grappling with governance, diversity after decades of Soviet rule. India thought these aspects could build trust.
And this led to India's first formal policy for the region, the Look North policy.
Yes, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao visited Turkmenistan in 1992, reiterated those historical ties, and formally unveiled the Look North policy. The goals, while maybe not always laid out in one document, were implicitly clear: reestablish political relationships, reassert cultural ties, and pursue economic engagement, especially resources, security cooperation, countering extremism, and boosting India's political influence.
But implementing that policy hit immediate headwinds, right? The security situation in the mid-90s got much worse.
Incredibly challenging. The Taliban taking Kabul in '96 was huge. Pakistan recognizing them heightened India's fears. Extremism from Afghanistan fueled the civil war in Tajikistan, and Pakistan was aggressively trying to revive militancy in Kashmir. The whole region felt increasingly unstable.
How did India respond directly to the Taliban takeover?
Despite limited military reach then, India supported groups fighting the Taliban. Along with Russia and Iran, India backed the Northern Alliance. The force gives concrete examples. India built a military hospital near Farkhor Air Base in Tajikistan for wounded Northern Alliance fighters. Used the Aini Air Base for humanitarian aid into Afghanistan.
So this practical cooperation strengthened ties, especially with Tajikistan?
It definitely did. But the broader goals of Look North became harder to achieve with extremist forces gaining ground. And India's own vulnerabilities were exposed by the IC-814 hijacking in '99, taken to Taliban-controlled Kandahar. Underscored the direct threat.
Then came the massive global shock of 9/11, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq. How did this reshape things for India and Central Asia?
Fundamentally changed the landscape.
Okay.
The U.S. presence in Central Asia exploded, air bases, supply lines, coordination centers for the GWOT. India looked at this new reality and realized the original Look North policy from the early '90s wasn't really equipped for this. Its goals were hard to promote. It wasn't proving robust enough.
And India's economy was also taking off around then, needing more resources.
Right. By 2000, 2001, liberalization was bearing fruit, growth accelerating. And that came with this dire, increasing need for reliable energy and resources. India needed new tools, a new perspective for Central Asia, now seeing its resources as critical for India's own future.
Why was Look North considered weak, though? The source has a case study on that.
It points to a mix of factors. First, as we said, the deteriorating security, Tajik civil war, Taliban, Kashmir militancy just overshadowed everything else. Huge security concerns.
And secondly, the source suggests India itself didn't aggressively prioritize the region right after the Cold War.
That's key. India had other big priorities. Improving ties with the U.S. to fill the Soviet vacuum was one. Launching the Look East policy towards Southeast Asia took a lot of energy and resources. Central Asia, unfortunately, suffered from relative neglect in terms of high-level attention compared to these.
And the security situation probably reinforced seeing the region just through a security lens, missing the economic potential.
Seems likely. The source concludes it was a mixture. The tough external environment and India's own prioritization choices and lack of aggressive follow-through made Look North less effective than hoped.
But things started shifting again mid-2000s, leading to a new policy, the Connect Central Asia Policy, CC8.
Several things converged. The U.S. presence post-9/11, while complex, did disrupt the immediate Taliban threat, somewhat stabilizing Afghanistan, indirectly affecting Central Asia. India's ties with the U.S. also warmed significantly. The civil nuclear deal in 2005, the NSG waiver in 2008, opened new strategic doors, and crucially, the Indian economy kept growing fast, and its hunger for resources grew exponentially.
So India needed a new framework, driven by this resource need.
Precisely. The policy reorientation was explicitly based on economic diplomacy. Securing energy, exploring economic opportunities became the primary thrust. Security remained important, the region was still fragile, but the core driver was economic.
But India faced a big challenge jumping back in economically, right? China.
A massive challenge. China hadn't been idle. They'd already made huge economic inroads into Central Asia since the Cold War ended, establishing a dominant presence, securing resources, building infrastructure.
So the space for India was limited.
Significantly limited compared to the early '90s. So India's new challenge was charting a path for balanced engagement in a region where China and Russia were already deeply entrenched. This led to things like the India-CA dialogue, a Track 11 initiative from ICWA starting in 2012, fostering dialogue.
And the formal CTCAP announcement came in June 2012 in Bishkek.
Yes. CTCAP laid out a clear vision, emphasizing connectivity physical, digital to boost trade, movement, and critically, energy security. A key initiative under CTCAP is the International North-South Transit Corridor, INSTC.
Right. The source has a case study, a multimodal network.
It is. Planned network linking India, Iran, Russia using sea, rail, road. Launched back in 2000, ratified 2002, India's been really keen because it offers a way to connect with Central Asia without going through Pakistan, which is often unreliable politically.
And it's seen as a counter to China's Belt and Road.
That's definitely part of the strategic thinking. The direct benefits are clear. Lower trade costs, much faster transit times compared to traditional routes via Suez or longer land paths, and there's been progress.
Like developing Chabahar port in Iran.
Exactly. The India-Iran MOU on Chabahar in 2013 was key. Developing that port is crucial for making INSTC work. Legal frameworks for transit, customs were agreed in 2015. India's trade policy explicitly pushed for INSTC.
So CTCAP isn't just INSTC. What else falls under it?
It's meant to be comprehensive, civilian level, youth exchanges, India providing IT skills training, military security. joint counterterrorism exercises, intelligence sharing to tackle extremism, drug trafficking.
So CCAP provides this broader framework for India to engage, trying to make up lost time and build ties based on current realities. Okay, let's zoom out now. What are India's core strategic interests in Central Asia today, pulling all this together?
Since the Cold War ended, India has been navigating this complex scene. Two big developments shape its interests. First, that persistent, sometimes acute, security deterioration due to extremism. And second, the huge rise of China's influence.
China really moved fast into the vacuum left by Russia economically.
Very strategically, China's own growth needed resources. Central Asia was right there. Their long-term policy was consistent: open relations, fixed border issues, integrate economies, secure resources.
And they executed it very effectively.
They did. While India dealt with other things, China resolved border issues, demilitarized sections, flooded CA economies with cheap goods, took resources in return, cemented their presence, became the dominant trade partner for many.
So from 2000 to 2010, India's focus was still heavily security-driven, supporting the U.S. and the GWOT because extremism affected everyone.
Right, and the U.S.-led removal of the Taliban in Afghanistan actually created a new opening for India. With the Taliban out temporarily and the U.S. facilitating a new order, India could increase its role in Afghanistan nation-building development projects helped by U.S. support.
And Afghanistan then became seen as a potential physical bridge to Central Asia.
Precisely. With Pakistan blocked, India saw Afghanistan and Iran as the crucial corridors for physical connectivity. Afghanistan borders CA. Iran offers sea access via its ports.
Which brings us to that case study calling Iran a potential linchpin for India's CA strategy.
That's the argument. Afghanistan's landlocked, needs sea access. Iran provides it. Back in 92-93, India and Iran set up a joint commission. India studied using Iranian routes, found Iran had decent infrastructure roads, legal security for cargo, railways.
And this led to investments like Chabahar and INSTC.
Exactly. Based on that potential, India, Iran, Turkmenistan signed an MOU in 95 for railroad access via Iran. India is invested in the Zaranj-Del Aram highway in Afghanistan connecting to the Iranian border, and of course Chabahar port for INSTC.
The source mentions DCAC-1000, an electricity project, but India is not involved.
Correct. That connects Central Asian power to Afghanistan and Pakistan, not India. India's focus via CCCAP since maybe 2010 has been twofold: reconnecting for its own resource security and growth, but also offering CA states an alternative economic partner to balance China's dominance.
Okay, so summarizing India's core strategic interests today.
Multiple levels.
Right.
Historical, geopolitical, economic. Geopolitically, it's still a zone of competition: Russia, China, U.S. Interestingly, the source notes India and the U.S. share a strategic interest in ensuring no single power dominates Central Asia.
And India's most fundamental interests are security-driven.
Absolutely. Core interest 1, prevent CA becoming part of a larger Islamic radicalism belt threatening India. Core interest 2, limit Pakistan's influence, preventing them gaining strategic depth against India.
And some diplomats worry about the U.S. or China using CA to limit India's own influence.
That's noted as another layer. To address this, India deepens security cooperation, especially narc terrorism, engages Tajikistan and Afghanistan for stability, cooperates with Russia, U.S., Iran.
And there's that intelligence angle with RNAW.
Source says RNAW sees stability linked to the Uyghur situation in China's Xinjiang. India has historical Uyghur ties, maintains a presence in CA capitals, Bishkek, Almaty, Dushanbe, cultivates contacts, seen as strategic assets, giving India leverage or insight on regional stability, potential spillover.
And India joining the SCO recently.
Gives India another multilateral platform to engage CA states, work with others, China, Russia included, on stability, terrorism, extremism.
So core goals recap: energy, culture, preventing terrorism impacting India, regional stability, new export markets.
And the strategy is two-pronged. Engage individual states bilaterally via CCAP and cooperate with regional global players in multilateral settings like SCO to boost presence and tackle shared challenges.
We've touched on challenges like extremism. What else hinders India?
Beyond instability, rebuilding economic ties is tough. They diminished hugely post-Silk Route. Initiatives like the FOCIA CIS program help boost trade, but volumes are still small compared to potential or China's trade.
And the biggest structural challenge: geography, connectivity.
Absolutely. Central Asia is doubly landlocked.
Right.
Hard for them to reach markets, hard for India to connect reliably and cheaply. Need land connectivity.
Using old Silk routes sounds romantic, but it's complex today.
Hugely. security issues, border conflicts between other countries on potential routes, complex negotiations on transit, tariffs, infrastructure. India currently uses 4 different, often circuitous routes, highlights the fragmentation compared to a direct overland path.
Which brings us to that critical case study. India and failure to understand the local rules gets to the heart of implementation issues.
It's a key analysis. Argues that while India's goals were valid, counter-Pakistan asserted itself as a rising power. It struggled to fully grasp what Alexander Cooley called the local rules of operating in CA states.
What are these local rules India supposedly missed?
Cooley's idea here refers to the informal power dynamics, role of clans, patronage, the regime's obsession with survival and stability above all else, deep suspicion of external interference, especially in domestic politics. The source uses India's ambitions for the Aini Air Base in Tajikistan as an example.
What happened there?
Details are deferred, but the source says India's dream of a strategic base suffered a big blow, primarily because it neglected or misunderstood these fundamental local rules, how the leadership operates, makes decisions on external military presence.
So, not necessarily a failure of grand strategy, but of grasping the on-the-ground political realities.
That's the conclusion here. Failure to understand the intricate way CA states work, their sensitivities, hindered India's ability to assert a strategic power presence effectively, a lesson in needing nuance in foreign policy.
This brings us back to the new great game and the other players. We touched on the U.S. post 9/11. What were their broader interests?
Cold War, minimal engagement. Post-Cold War, 2 main interests initially. One, economic, integrate CA globally, maybe bypass Russian pipelines to Europe, like the BTC pipeline idea, though not directly through CA.
And the second emerged dramatically post 9/11.
Security. Location became vital for the GWOT. Bush admin prioritized ties, access bases in CA for Afghanistan ops, signed security deals, but they also aggressively pushed democracy export.
Which met resistance from the authoritarian regimes.
Big time. Seen as a threat. Things like the Andijan violence in Uzbekistan 2005, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan highlighted resistance, led to resentment, U.S. eviction from the K2 base in Uzbekistan.
So the U.S. learned they had to accept the local rules.
Pretty much. If they wanted to stay, they had to accept the regime's preference for authoritarian stability, their unwillingness to let powers challenge their domestic structure.
And Russia and China were fine with that authoritarianism.
That's a key difference. Both prefer stable autocrats over potentially unstable democracy moves that could spill over. Since about 2008, U.S. policy shifted away from democracy promotion, focusing more on security cooperation, logistics like the Northern Distribution Networks, NDN for Afghanistan withdrawal.
But the fundamental U.S. goal isn't hegemony in CA.
No, source says it's more about balancing. Reduce China's and Russia's influence, prevent either dominating rather than asserting U.S. hegemony. Engaging India helps the U.S. in this balancing act against Russia and especially China.
Okay, turning to Russia. Their interests are rooted in Cold War history, pipelines.
And the legacy of Soviet control. First post-Cold War decade, Russia was weak, domestic chaos left a vacuum China filled. But under Putin from 2000, Russia began reasserting authority in the post-Soviet space.
Initially cooperated with the U.S. post 9/11.
Yes, saw it as a chance to boost Russia's image. Plus, U.S. defeating Taliban indirectly helped Russia with Caucasus threats. But cooperation soured. Russia saw U.S. unilateralism, Iraq ABM treaty withdrawal as aggressive, viewed U.S. as a competitor in the post-Soviet space.
How did Russia counter?
Bolstered its own structures, strengthened the CSTO military alliance, challenger to NATO, pursued economic integration via Eurasian Economic Community Union, used the SKO platform with China to check U.S. influence.
So Russia's goal is no U.S. hegemony, no interference undermining its primacy.
Right. The 2005 Russia-Uzbekistan Security Treaty, pledging help against third-party aggression, supports this. Russia isn't trying to revive exact Cold War rule. It prefers legalizing regional primacy via CISO-EU, allowing CA states some external engagement, but on Russia's terms.
But the source says Russia's bigger challenge now comes from China, not the U.S.
Key insight. While they cooperate against the U.S., Russia is increasingly alarmed by China's economic muscle engulfing CA. SKO's rising profile driven by China frustrates Moscow. Scholar Stephen Kotkin suggests China makes no compromises, raising the prospect of Russia becoming China's junior partner there, a future Russia dislikes intensely.
That rivalry dynamic leads us to China, very resource-centric interests.
Absolutely, driven by need for energy raw materials. But China's also aware CA is Russia's backyard, so avoids overtly challenging Russia's position or asserting hegemony that might antagonize Moscow. Cooperates on security, buys Russian resources too, like the 2014 gas deal.
But China has another critical domestic security interest.
Yes, Xinjiang and the Uyghur issue. China took Xinjiang, East Turkestan, in 1759. Uyghurs resisted Chinese rule. Brief autonomy periods, then full Chinese control post-1949 as XAR. Policy of three inseparable ties reinforces Han dominance.
Plus encouraging Han migration into Xinjiang.
Systematically, yes, to make Uyghurs a minority. Met resistance. Post-Afghan War, 1980s, some Uyghur groups linked with extremists increased violence against Chinese presence.
And China sees a stable Central Asia as crucial to controlling this.
Absolutely crucial. Xinjiang is vital. Nuclear test site, missile base, huge oil gas reserves, borders Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. China needs stable, cooperative neighbors because instability or militance there could spill over, fuel Uyghur militancy, destabilize a vital internal region.
So neutralizing threats from CA is core, often via SEO.
Exactly. Cooperation essential to contain the three evils, separatism, extremism, terrorism, often linked to Uyghurs. China's Go West campaign to modernize Xinjiang also relies on CA states as markets and partners in containing cross-border threats.
And post-2005, China developed that hedging strategy regarding Afghanistan.
Yes. Uncomfortable working directly with the West there. Cultivated close ties with Pakistan's ISI. Through ISI, maintains indirect contact with the Taliban. Provides security guarantees for Chinese investments in Afghanistan. And a channel to pressure Taliban not to let anti-China groups operate from Afghan soil and cause trouble in Xinjiang.
So China plays a very deliberate game in this new great game.
The source uses that metaphor. U.S. says CA isn't Russia's zone, but accepts reality. China publicly says it is Russia's sphere, deferring to Moscow, but quietly creates its own dominant economic rules and security frameworks on the ground via SKO. If CA is Russia's backyard, China's redrawing the fences.
Really captures the nuance. Let's look closer at why China created SEO. Started as Shanghai 5 for borders.
Yes, 9601, China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, fixed borders, military confidence building. Around 2000, talks broadened beyond borders to separatism, extremism.
Leading to SKO in June 2001.
Exactly. Uzbekistan joined, formalized as SEO, broader rubric for security issues, guided by credit attribution for self-promotion, ensuring SKO got credit for security contributions, boosting its image.
Then 9/11 hit just months later. Game changer.
Massive. China saw the new global focus on terror, strategically conflated Veer separatist CTIM with al-Qaeda. This let China frame its internal Xinjiang crackdown as part of the U.S.-led GWOT, gaining international legitimacy.
But China also feared the increased U.S. presence in CA.
Deeply. Worried a permanent U.S. presence could choke off energy supplies, or worse, be used to destabilize Xinjiang, contain China. Response was proactive. Institutionalized Shanghai 5 into SKO before 9/11 fully unfolded.
And push for structures like RETS.
Yes, proposed the regional anti-terrorism structure in June 2002. Crucially, SKO Charter Article 2 asserted members wouldn't accept external unilateral interference in CA internal issues aimed at Washington. Events like Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution, 2005, fueled fears of U.S.-backed regime change that could inspire dissent in China-Russia.
Leading to Uzbekistan asking the U.S. to leave the K2 base.
Widely seen as under Russia-China pressure via SKO. U.S. saw it as Russia-China using non-military tools via SKO to undermine U.S. policies.
Finally, let's consider Pakistan's role and the Turkmenget case study.
Pakistan's key, linked via Afghanistan. The Durand Line dispute complicates things. Turkmenget incident, 2016. Pakistan restricting entry into Afghanistan showed this tension.
How did that relate to Central Asia?
Restricted movement towards CA2. Source suggests such actions might serve Pakistan short-term, but risk isolating it long-term by hindering its own integration into regional connectivity.
Yeah.
A broader Central Asia-South Asia, CASA, partnership needs regional consensus on transit. Pakistan might benefit more from being an active partner.
We've certainly covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive. From the ancient Silk Road, the 19th century Great Game, Soviet rule, the post-Cold War vacuum, 9/11 shifts, and India's evolving efforts to reconnect.
We've seen how Central Asia remains profoundly important for India historically, geopolitically, economically, just as it has been for centuries.
And how it's still this dynamic zone of competition. Russia, China, the U.S., all vying for influence, each with distinct interests, distinct strategies. We've looked at India's core objective, security concerns about extremism, limiting Pakistan's influence.
And discussed how India tries to balance its need for resources and connectivity with the complexities of dealing with authoritarian regimes, navigating established players, and overcoming those big geographical hurdles.
Absolutely. That enduring nature of the great game, just with new players and rules, is really striking. And India, as we explored, has faced specific challenges, particularly, as the source material suggests, in fully grasping and adapting to the local rules of the Central Asian states themselves.
Hmm.
So, given this intricate history, the competing interests, India's past difficulties in navigating internal dynamics, consider this. What it might be the single most significant, maybe most subtle obstacle India faces in achieving its long-term strategic goals, resources, stability, influence in this incredibly complex, contested neighborhood. It's a question that pushes beyond just geography or rivals into the real nuances of engagement itself.
Indeed. A successful approach needs more than just grand strategy. It needs that deep, nuanced understanding of the ground realities, the history, the motivations of the regional actors themselves. It's a fascinating puzzle, and the stakes are definitely high.